Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, how some Native American tribes in the U.S. are getting their land back.
In an historic move for the Washoe people, over 10,000 acres of their ancestral homeland in the Sierra Nevada are set to be returned.
From Wisconsin to California, Indigenous nations are reacquiring land. But what does getting land back actually mean for a tribe? I'm Natasha del Toro, and this is The Take. Before we continue with today's episode, please remember to leave us a comment and let us know what you think about today's episode and what kinds of stories that you want to see us do next. Or if you're listening on the podcast app, let us know where you're listening from and leave us a 5-star review while you're there. It helps people find the show. If you've been following Indigenous rights movements around the world, you've probably heard the term land back. It refers to a movement and a rallying cry to return native stolen lands back to tribal control. In Wisconsin, a Catholic congregation of nuns wanted to atone for the Catholic Church's role in abusive boarding schools for Native Americans. They sold a parcel of land to the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa for a massively reduced price.
Signed, sealed, and delivered.
All right, that officially concludes the transfer of the property to the Lac du Flambeau tribe.
Meanwhile, in California, the Washoe tribe is set to reacquire over 10,000 acres of its ancestral homeland, partly funded by a state conservation grant.
California Wildlife Conservation Board has awarded $5.5 million to the newly formed Washoe People Land Trust, supporting the purchase of a property northeast of Lake Tahoe.
Both stories have been celebrated as victories. But what does getting land back actually mean for a tribe? It turns out the reality is far more complex than the headlines suggest. I spoke to Rebecca Nagle, a Cherokee writer and journalist, to learn more about the fight for land back and tribal sovereignty in the United States.
Osio Naga Gohin Dawdon Telek, Oklahoma Janelle. Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Nagle and I am in Tahlequah, Oklahoma today.
Rebecca, it is a thrill to have you here on The Take. A lot of our audiences may be familiar with the term land back. You see it on social media or protests or political speeches, but they might not actually know what it looks like in practice. So maybe if you could briefly explain to us, what is the land back movement? What's it calling for? And walk us through how Native American people actually regain control of ancestral lands. How does that actually work?
So my understanding is that land back as a movement and as a hashtag and as a slogan was started by Indigenous youth in Canada. And obviously it has spread over all of what people call Turtle Island.
Wait, what's Turtle Island? Sorry.
Like an indigenous term for North America. And so when Native people say land back, they're talking about, yes, acreage, actual physical land, but oftentimes all of the things that are tied to that. Because as Indigenous people, we didn't just lose land. Whenever we lost land, we also lost culture, access to sacred sites, language. And so a lot of times when people are saying land back, what they really mean is the restoration of all of these things that are important to our Indigenous nations. So it's land back, culture back, language back, sovereignty back. And what's happening now that it's catching on that's exciting is that people are also seeing that the stewardship of land by Indigenous nations is great for everybody. Indigenous people worldwide protect the biodiversity of our globe. Indigenous people are really good at managing lands, oftentimes because we have that long knowledge, that old knowledge of how to take care of land and how to interact with it in a good way. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing more and more cities, states, private landowners restoring land to the Indigenous nations through either gifting it back or coming up with co-management strategies.
And that's helpful to understand because I think when people hear that term land back, they might envision sort of a single unified process there. But you're saying that it actually can mean a lot of things, right?
Yeah. And I would say that tribes have been working on the restoration of treaty lands and ancestral lands before it was a hashtag, right? Before it was a movement, whether it's through court cases or diplomacy. Tribes have been working on that for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And just in this last month, we've seen two stories of land being returned to tribes, the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa in Wisconsin, and the Washoe tribe in California. How do you see these stories fitting into this larger picture of the land back movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that moments like that are really important, I think one important thing that gets missed is that there's a difference between a tribe owning a piece of land and having jurisdiction over that land. And it sounds confusing, but a tribe can own a piece of land, but own it almost like you or I would own land. So just because I own a piece of land doesn't mean that I can exercise jurisdiction or have taxes, or things like that.
So we're getting into a lot of topics here that I think are really important to parse out. Tell me, what is the difference then between a tribe owning the land and actually having jurisdiction over it? Like, what is the reality on the ground there?
Yeah, so a tribe can own land, just, like any entity owns property. But for the tribe to be able to exercise jurisdiction, that land has to have another special sort of legal designation. So it could be reservation land. It could be what's called trust land, which is where it's put in trust. And actually, technically, what trust land means, when you get into it, it's kind of messed up, but it's actually technically held by the federal government in trust for the benefit of tribes, which goes back to the weird, precarious legal status that tribes have in the United States. So there's reservation land and there's trust land. And trust land can be within a reservation, but it also can be outside of a reservation. Not every tribe in the United States has a reservation. I think a lot of people think that if you're a tribe, you have a reservation, but not every tribe does.
Okay.
I think the big takeaway is that a lot of times people think, oh, if a tribe owns the land, they can just exercise jurisdiction on it. But that's not how it works.
Right.
And the jurisdiction that tribes can exercise on their land is really limited. And I think is a lot more limited than most people realize.
So what power do tribes have or don't have when it comes to, say, criminal justice or civil authority or even just everyday governance?
So let's start with criminal jurisdiction, which is basically the power to prosecute crimes. So like things like theft or murder. Tribes don't have criminal jurisdiction over non-natives. So if you're not native, you can go onto a tribe and you can steal a car, steal a pack of gum, murder somebody, and the tribe can't prosecute you.
Wow.
There are some exceptions to that rule that have been passed through the Violence Against Women Act that mostly have to do with crimes involving violence against women and children. So things like domestic violence, sexual assault. Overall, tribal jurisdiction over non-natives is very limited. And that's actually led to a crisis of violence in Indian country. And so you see, while violent crime has trended down in recent decades across the United States, on a lot of reservations, it's trended up because people were taking advantage of this legal loophole. And so Native women face really high rates of violence. So 8 out of 10 Native women will experience sexual assault, domestic violence, or stalking in their lifetime. And the majority of people who are perpetrating those crimes are non-Native.
More with Rebecca after the break. So, Rebecca, all this to say, it is a lot more complicated than just if you own the land. There's a lot more to the story. And I know that you've written about this. I actually want to dig into one of the biggest legal cases that you covered, McGirt versus Oklahoma. You wrote a book about it called By the Fire We Carry. So in 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that 19 million acres in Oklahoma are still reservation land and returned it to several different Native American tribes.
It was a momentous decision, a recent Supreme Court ruling that much of eastern Oklahoma remains Indian country, granting jurisdictional control for criminal justice cases to the Muskogee Creek Nation and 4 neighboring tribal nations.
Maybe you could take us back and tell us what led to that case.
So it actually started in a really surprising place. It started as a small town murder. So in 1999, a Muskogee citizen named Patrick Murphy murdered another Muskogee citizen named George Jacobs, and that all took place on the Muskogee Reservation. Patrick was prosecuted by Oklahoma and sentenced to death. And it was actually in the course of his death penalty appeals that his lawyers came up with this argument. And what they said is, wait. Oklahoma doesn't have jurisdiction to prosecute this crime because it happened on a reservation, and states can't prosecute Native folks for crimes committed on a reservation. Only tribes and the federal government can.
Mm-hmm.
Oklahoma's response was, that reservation doesn't exist, and it hasn't existed in over a century. Once Oklahoma became a state in 1907, it argued that all of those reservations in the process of it becoming a state were abolished, had vanished. So basically, Oklahoma was saying, look, like, you made us, you gave us a state, like, why would you still have reservations within our state? But the way the rule for reservations works is that Oklahoma can't get rid of a reservation. The only body that can get rid of a reservation is Congress. And so the question before the Supreme Court was basically, did Congress ever get rid of this reservation? And going through the historical record, the answer was no. And so the case was actually this real question of whether or not the Supreme Court would follow the letter of the law, or would they sort of bend to non-Native interests? Would they say, well, okay, yes, this is what the treaty says and this is what the law says, but it hasn't been recognized for so long and so many non-Native people live there and it would cause so much of a disruption. And that kind of thinking happens all the time in court cases about our treaty rights, right? Where the treaty right is clear, the law is clear, but upholding it would cause too much of a disruption now. And what is remarkable about this case is that even though the stakes were high, the Supreme Court still followed the law. Mm-hmm. And while that is rare in our democracy, I think it's a case that shows that it's possible. And then what happened as a result of that is that a total of 8 reservations here in eastern Oklahoma have been upheld because then lower courts interpreted that Supreme Court decision and applied it to other tribes. And the total restoration of tribal land here in eastern Oklahoma is 19 million acres. It's over 40% of the land in the state. It's an area that is larger than West Virginia and 9 other U.S. states. When you put all the land together, it's the largest sort of block of tribal land in U.S. history, and it's the largest restoration, by far, the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history.
So this was a hugely significant case, and it did have its critics, too. I mean, Oklahoma State Governor Kevin Stitt opposed the McGirt ruling pretty intensely, saying, as I've said from the beginning, McGirt not only creates a public safety nightmare, but threatens the sovereignty of our state to its core. Oklahoma is being cobbled up piece by piece. This cannot stand. Rebecca, what do you make of that reaction?
I think that that's why it's really important for people to understand how limited tribal jurisdiction on tribal land is, because Oklahoma basically ran around like Chicken Little and said, the sky is going to fall down, the sky is going to fall down. And then after the decision said, the sky is falling down, the sky is falling down. And their claims were extremely exaggerated. But because people don't know how jurisdiction on tribal land works, they get away with sort of how exaggerated their claims were. For most non-Native people living in eastern Oklahoma, the reservations didn't affect their lives that much. Their kids go to the same school, the same municipality picks up their garbage.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I mean, you said that when this Supreme Court ruling came down that people thought the sky was falling. And like, what are the common fears and arguments that you hear from people opposing tribal jurisdiction?
Oh, people said all sorts of stuff. I mean, oil and gas said that it would disrupt the industry and create, regulatory red tape. District attorneys came together and said that all of these past convictions would be thrown out. And then they tried to say that ongoing prosecutions, that there were all these cases that were happening that weren't being prosecuted. And so there was a moment where the prosecution of cases shifted from state court to federal court and tribal court. And it was a big shift. It was thousands of cases. And so tribes had to hire new police, hire new prosecutors, hire new victim advocates. Some even built new court buildings. But all of the sort of horrible things that people said would happen really didn't come to fruition. And I think that that's why it is so important to combat this ignorance that, once a tribe has a piece of land, that then they can do anything that they want on it.
And so this is a case that really illustrates the difference between just simply owning land and having jurisdiction over the land. Now, you wrote back in September on Blue Sky about the Trump administration's 20-point plan on Gaza, and you actually drew a direct line from this Gaza plan to historic U.S. policy toward Indigenous people. Now, some people might think that this was a leap, but you were drawing this straight line. So maybe you could explain for our audience what did you mean by that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels between what's happened to Palestine and what's happened to Indigenous people in the United States. There's a big term called settler colonialism that basically describes, if there's a group of people living on land that you want, the process that governments use to dispossess those people of that land and eventually take it. And so one of the things that happened to us as Indigenous people is that we would be promised pieces of land, oftentimes when people wanted us to move away. What always happened to us was that that land would leave Indigenous hands by sale, swindle, theft. Sometimes we wouldn't even get it from the government. And when you look at the early 20-point plan that the Trump administration made for Gaza, it's that kind of thing where Gaza residents can get a token. And that actually also happened during our removal. So in the 1830s, the U.S. had this policy of ethnic cleansing towards Indigenous people living in the Southeast, so in like Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. And with multiple tribes, the government struck this deal where if you leave, if you move out, we'll give you money for your land, individual, Muskogee citizen, individual Choctaw citizen. And those people oftentimes never saw that money. The removal was extremely violent and extremely forceful. And so there are all of these parallels around how we are thinking about the future of Gaza that actually are quite remarkably similar to how the U.S. has treated Indigenous nations.
So as you were hearing about that, you were thinking, there's a lot here that's familiar to Native American history.
I mean, it's what they did to us. Yeah.
So we're having this conversation the week of Thanksgiving, which is a day where many Americans tell a very tidy story about peaceful cooperation between Indigenous people and settlers. But that mythology exists alongside this present day reality.
I think that the myth serves a really important function in American society. And so, as countries to kind of build a national identity, we use stories, right? And so we tell the story of like George Washington cutting down the cherry tree, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the myth of Thanksgiving is one of those foundational national stories that we tell to kind of say, like, this is who we are as a country, right? And it's this myth that, settlers were welcomed here by Indigenous people. That myth exists to ignore the obvious truth that this land was settled not by friendship, but by violence. And it's even there right at the beginning. So, the man who served as a translator between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims knew English because he had been kidnapped and enslaved in Europe and had been able to find his way back home. Early Thanksgiving celebrations during the colonial era were feast days that were held in celebration of massacres of Indigenous people. And so, like, we can pick like one moment that there's like a conditional, like mutual defense pact between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, and there's this moment of peace. But the full story, and you don't really have to zoom out that far, is extremely violent. And so we tell this story so that we can pretend like that never happened.
And that it's still, I mean, hundreds of years later, there are still present day realities that tribes are facing, and they still are fighting for basic like sovereignty over their lands. Given everything that we've been talking about in this conversation, some of the barriers that you've been discussing, this legal trust process, limited jurisdiction, ongoing legal battles, how should we be measuring quote unquote success when we talk about the land back movement today?
I think we need to start thinking about land back in bigger ways. I think these moments of, 100 acres here, 10,000 acres, here, it's significant, right? And especially when those lands contain sacred sites and places that are significant to tribes. Those are very, very important victories. But I think we need to think more broadly about land stewardship in the United States and restoring more land to tribes, not just for the benefit of Indigenous nations, but because actually things like fire and climate change and ecological collapse, that actually Indigenous nations have a base of knowledge about how to take care of the land that everybody would benefit from, right? And so, I think that we really need to think about restoring tribal jurisdiction. And I think that the present day implications, though, are bigger than just what it means for Indigenous nations. Because again, the Thanksgiving myth is about nation building, is about what kind of country we are. And I think there are a lot of people living through our current political moment who feel like it's unprecedented or un-American, all of these things that are happening in our country today. And I think that's just because we don't know our history. And I think so much of how our government treated Indigenous peoples is actually just coming home to roost in the policies of the current administration.
Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on The Take. That was such a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.